program at the Senator John Hines History Center. I would like to move along with the program and remind everyone that if you have questions or comments, please place them in the chat or the Q&A so our two panelists can address them. I do want to start now with introductions. And I first want to introduce, Alonna Carter-Donaldson, who is representing the Frick Museum, partially representing the Frick Museum, but she is a graduate student scheduled to graduate in December of this year with a master's degree. A local historian has done an awful lot of work in a very short span of time, I might say, but has looked a lot at Black Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh's Black history as well. Our second panelist is Gretchen Sorin, that you saw so much in the film. She's the author of the book, Driving While Black, and is also the distinguished professor and chair of the Cooperstown Graduate Program at the State University of New York in Oneonta. So please welcome our guest panelists for tonight's program. And we do have a question well, we actually have a comment in the Q&A from Benita Penn, who says, excellent, excellent. And then asks a question about the movie being shown at schools and other venues. I think it should be shown at schools and other venues. I did not mention that it is a PBS produced film. You can get the DVD, you can go to PBS website to find out more information about the film, but it is, as I guess we all will agree, a must-see film. So I do want to start off with Gretchen and ask her about, what was the process for not only doing the book, doing this study, but also producing it as a documentary film?
Well, I really got interested in the story of Driving While Black while I was working on an exhibition. I'm primarily an exhibition curator, and I was working on an exhibition about the history of African Americans in Saratoga Springs, New York. And a colleague of mine handed me the Negro Motorist Green Book. And that's what I had never seen it before. And that's what got me really thinking about, what are these travel guides and what were they for, who used them? So I started there, but I quickly moved from the Green Book to the automobile and the impact that the automobile had on African American life. And that's where my book, Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights, that's how I got to the story that's in the book. And many of the interviews that are now a part of the film started out as interviews that I did for the book. I think the automobile was an incredibly important tool for Black people as they started to venture across the country, leave their own neighborhoods and travel for vacation or for business, and to get away from the Jim Crow bus and the Jim Crow rail car. And so I talk, as you can see, a lot about the book, about the automobile and the interstate highway system, which facilitates travel. So that's how I got there. The movie started because as I was working on the book, I was collecting images. I was collecting pictures of people with their cars, pictures of African-American businesses, African-American neighborhoods. And I had an old friend, Rick Burns, who I had been in a film that he did called New York, a documentary film. And I approached him and I said, I really think this is a very visual story. and that there's a soundscape as well to this story, and it needs to be a film, not just a book. And so that's how we got started on the movie.
Great, great. Alonna, I know that in some of your research, I mean, you deal with, this same time period. What were some of the things that jumped out to you in the film that kind of, um, uh, is connected to your own work?
That's a great question. So many things. Um, I want to say just in the beginning, looking at some of the reasons for migration, the racial terrorism that a lot of African Americans experience, that kind of made them feel like they had to find somewhere to escape to. That was something that I came across a lot, not just in my in research that I did for the Frick exhibition, but also looking at my own family history, because my great great grandparents actually came from Alabama during the Great Migration, and I'd always wanted to understand what was the motivation outside of them coming for work. What was the motivation for them coming to Pittsburgh? So that was definitely kind of a main thing that came out of the film that coincided with some of the research I've done.
Okay, I do have one other question. I'm looking in the chat right now. We don't actually have any questions there. But one of the things that I noticed, I guess for me personally, not only with this film, but the Green Book film and our exhibits, was that there are things that I guess I had placed so far back in my memory that I didn't realize was part of the travel strategy that African Americans had, just simple things. I think that Candace in her book Overground Railroad talks about the number of license plates that African Americans who lived in the North had. And my grandfather had in his garage license plates. And I just thought, well, granddad collects license plates, and that's how I learned about states, by the different states and these different license plates. Well, what Candace talks about is people using those license plates, and whether it's illegal or not, it's a survival strategy. You put that license plate on your car if you're driving from Chicago to Mississippi. You have a Mississippi license plate, you put that license plate on your car. Because of the vulnerability for out-of-state Black drivers being pulled over or harassed or whatever, and so forth. And so you had strategies. They talked about it a lot in the film, and I appreciate Gretchen doing this, is illustrating how people actually either took the Green Book or other travel guides, or without those vehicles, to actually plan, this is how far we can drive on a tank of gas. And so we need to know where we will be safe to stop and fill up with more gas, or to relieve ourselves, or to just get something to eat, or just to rest or whatever. So these types of survival strategies were very, very important to the Black traveler. Gretchen, can you talk a little bit about the process of developing not only your book, but the film portion, in terms of how did you decide on who to interview for this work?
Well, I started out talking to, this will surprise you. I started out talking to my hairdresser, and in a beauty salon in Albany, New York. And she was the first person I talked to. She was an older woman, and she had come to New York in the 1930s, I think, to study at one of the beauty schools in New York. And so I just was talking to her one day, and all the women in the beauty parlor started telling me their stories. And that's how it kind of grew from there. One person would connect me to another person who would connect me to another person. When we started working on the film, we carefully selected places in the country that we knew had African-American resorts. So Rock Rest, for example, LA, we knew Colorado, we knew there were specific communities, Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard, specific communities that were resort areas that welcomed African Americans. And we would go to the historical societies, the libraries there, and ask about people who might have stories to tell. And that's how we ended up with our list. It was really very much word of mouth, and people who we got connected to through just visiting those places where African Americans went.
I found it also, you know, the story about train travel, the train cars that African Americans had to sit in as they traveled. I remember as a child traveling with my mother from Cincinnati, Ohio, to her home in Wake County, North Carolina, and I was very young, but I do remember sitting in what essentially was a boxcar on this train, and I never really understood until I got older and began to learn, you know, about segregation and oppression and so forth. And so those types of things become realizations for many of us, as we just don't understand when we're a child what's going on in the world around us. But we are protected and carried through that world, you know, by our parents or someone else who knows and understands it. And I thought the film really pointed that out very much. But the more recent aspects of Driving While Black, with many, and you know, the Philando Castile, I think his name is,
Yes.
episode comes back to me personally because I'm a graduate at University of Cincinnati. And I don't know if many people know that there was a University of Cincinnati police officer who killed him. And he was not on the campus. And so the other interesting part was that the part of the city that he was in borders the campus, but it's relatively a gentrified section of the community. It was traditionally an African-American, a predominantly African-American community. I remember as a child playing football there and all that type of thing. But it's been gentrified by the university as the university has expanded and has taken over that type of territory, but still he was not on the campus. So that is, you know, as we know, just another, you know, episode in this whole issue of race and racism in law enforcement and the inability to recognize what I see as the humanity in African American people.
I think it really brings the story up to the present. It really highlights it. And I think Alonna could speak to the whole issue of how the Great Migration how the automobile facilitates the Great Migration. Because she's a product of it. I'm also a product of the Great Migration. My parents came from North Carolina to New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. And right after they came after World War II to the north. But it's the automobile that facilitates the ability of people. Some people do take the train and people take buses, but the car is one way you could get out without people knowing you were leaving if you had to sneak out of town. And a lot of people did use automobiles.
Exactly. Alonna, can you tell us a little bit more about the Frick's project and your role in it?
Yes. So really, the exhibition for Pittsburgh and the Great Migration was the brainchild of the former associate curator of the Car and Carriage Museum, who is Kim Cady. And Kim actually saw an opportunity and a need to share stories of hope amidst resistance, and also in the face of strife and struggle. So what the exhibit does is it encapsulates a time period through objects that are relatable to everyone, cars and clothing. And if you do happen to visit it, you will see, for lack of a better pun, it definitely transports you through time periods with these different beautiful cars. And the reason for that connection is that the cars, of course, as we saw from the film, were symbols of independence. They were symbols of freedom. And they also helped people to become socially mobile. And they represented power as well as style status. For my role, I actually kind of wore two hats during the entire project. In 2022, I was the publication assistant. So I was responsible for helping out with the museum catalog that you mentioned, Mr. Sam, and sourcing photographs from different repositories, reaching out to those contacts to get the rights, as well as connecting with authors like Dr. Sorin to make sure that their essays were put together in a timely fashion. And then in 2023, just earlier this year, for the exhibition, I actually was the research assistant, and I put together a timeline of events that coincided with the Great Migration that you will also see in the exhibit. And what I wanted to do with that timeline is I wanted it to not only showcase what was happening during the Great Migration and make people want to, find opportunity elsewhere, but also to highlight the progress, because I really believe that regardless, of course, we have this story of that, and a lot of times is really difficult, and it's sometimes tragic, the African-American story, but there's also joy within that story. And we were making progress and strides even in the face of being denied some of these basic rights. So that's pretty much what my role was, and just again highlighting a lot of the photographs that you see in the exhibit, making sure that they aligned with the story that we were trying to tell.
Great, great. We do have a question in the chat from Louise DeRizzo. She asks, were there Black neighborhoods that were destroyed in Pennsylvania when building the interstate highways? I can address some of that. I don't know all over Pennsylvania, but I think that any major city in the United States, the interstate highway went through, and most of those places, at least the places that I lived, they went through the Black community. Here in Pittsburgh, you had sort of a two-pronged situation. The Lower Hill District was demolished beginning around 1954 in Pittsburgh to make way for what became the Civic Arena, which is no longer there, ironically. And it was all part of what they call the Pittsburgh Renaissance. You had two phases of the Renaissance. And it was done with federal money. And it was illustrated in the film, to recognize areas that were basically looked upon as undesirable. They began early on by calling the Lower Hill a slum. And, we don't have time to go into all of that, but the result was in the early 60s, the opening of the Civic Arena, which was originally built for the orchestra here, but wind up being the hockey arena for decades. And then you had an interstate system that went through the Lower Hill. So the interstate system sort of separated the Lower Hill district from downtown. And what was illustrated in the film with a number of places, I think they pointed out New Orleans and it was somewhere else, where the interstate system basically destroyed a major community thoroughfare. So those things happen in a number of different places, but they definitely happened in Pittsburgh. So that's one illustration of Pennsylvania. I'm not as familiar with Philadelphia in that sense. There's another question in the chat. It says, thank you, Gretchen, for your moving work and your presence tonight. I am an artist and art teacher at the Frick. This is from Ada Griffin, and I am grateful for your thorough account of U.S. history. Is there anything you'd like to share about your research in regards to Pittsburgh specifically? And then she asks, she would also like to hear from Alonna about one thing you hope people take away from the Great Migration exhibit.
I think one of the things about Pittsburgh that I appreciate the most is the Pittsburgh Courier. Black newspapers in this country provide an incredible source of information for historians as we do our research. And one of the most influential and most important newspapers was the Pittsburgh Courier. So I have used the Pittsburgh Courier a lot for my research. The other thing about these newspapers was that they were national. We think of the Pittsburgh Courier as just being in Pittsburgh. Well, it wasn't. People all over the African Americans got Black newspapers from many different cities. Excuse me. My father worked for the Baltimore Afro-American, and he was actually a photographer for the Baltimore Afro in Newark. So most of the Black newspapers had reporters and photographers in other cities who were gathering news for those papers. So the Black press is this amazing source of information that many historians don't ever tap. White historians just don't bother to look at them. And yet the stories that are in the Black press are very different from the stories in the white press. So I would say that was perhaps my favorite source in working on Pittsburgh.
Alonna?
Yes, I just like to say that the main thing that I hope everyone takes away from the exhibition is that the Great Migration is everyone's story. It's an American story, it's everyone's story. And regardless if your family came during it or whatever, they were somehow impacted by it socially and culturally. So I just hope that that is something that everyone takes from it when they visit.
If I can add to Gretchen's answer about the Pittsburgh Courier and the Black press, one of the distinctions of the Courier was that it had, I think, about 14 national editions. So if you bought the paper in Los Angeles or in Detroit or in New Orleans or in Florida, you were getting the edition for that particular region. So there was a Louisiana edition of the Pittsburgh Courier. And all of these papers, this is the magnificent thing of production for that time. All of the papers were printed in Pittsburgh and then shipped to those locations. And so people would be able to get a Pittsburgh Courier Louisiana edition while they're in New Orleans, and it would have news about Black people in Louisiana and not Pittsburgh. So the Pittsburgh Courier City edition was the only one that was produced to give you news about people in Pittsburgh. So that was an interesting one. The Afro-American had a similar thing, but it was on a smaller scale. The Afro-American is one of the other African-American papers that joined the Courier in the Double V campaign back during World War II. Yep. Although the Chicago Defender was probably because they eventually had a daily paper instead of a weekly, or in addition to a weekly. But the Defender had sort of perfected the use of the migration and its travel back and forth from north to south to distribute that newspaper. They, however, did not attempt to do local editions the way that the Courier and the Afro-American did. And that was sort of the distinction there. We have just like 2 minutes left. And of course, you know, time flies when you're having fun and having good discussion and conversation. So I'm going to ask Alonna if there are any last words that you would like to say.
Yes, come see the exhibit. That's all I have to say. You will not be disappointed, and it's just awesome, if I must say so myself.
And the exhibit will be open until February of 2024. So you have plenty of time. Come see it now while the weather's good. So Gretchen.
Oh, I get to say, well, I have to say that my research in Pittsburgh, it's been a joy to work with Pittsburgh and to get to do a little more research in Pittsburgh. And I appreciate the Frick and the Heinz Museum for taking on this topic. It's very important and it's timely.
Thank you. So on behalf of the Senator John Heinz History Center and the Frick Museum Pittsburgh, I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. And if you have any further questions, you can email me as always. But if you're online, that means we have your email address. So you will be receiving information about our next film, which I believe takes place in October. So that information is forthcoming. Thank you all and have a good night.
Night.